We are now going to analyze the basic maneuvers for moving on the river. That is, those maneuvers that permit us to have control during our descent. The basic maneuvers when undertaking a descent are essentially three. Eddy out to enter the current, eddy in to enter the eddy, ferry to cross a river or current stream, Performing these maneuvers properly means keeping in mind the three elements that characterize and affect them. Speed, or forward momentum, necessary when we must pass from one current to another, velocity that will be directly proportional to the current to be entered. Acceleration is obtained through propulsive stroking forward. The boof stroke is very efficient. Angle of incidence. This refers to the angle formed by the longitudinal axis of the kayak and the direction of the current. Varying the angle changes the push of the current against the hull. Angle of incidence varies in relation to the velocity of the current, the relative velocity of the kayak, and to the trajectory intended. Choosing the right angle facilitates the maneuver enormously. Lean. Changing the lean is achieved by edging the boat onto one side in order to offer the hull of the kayak to the current. Allowing the water to flow more smoothly under the bottom. In maneuvers, the kayak leans in towards the curve exactly like a motorcycle does. The degree of lean varies according to several factors. The skilled kayaker develops a feeling for how much edging is right. This is a maneuver that permits passing from an eddy zone into a zone of current by making a 180-degree curve. First, you pick up speed, then you edge the upstream side of the kayak to offer the hull to the current and cross the eddy line with an angle that permits the entire kayak to enter the current with a downstream rotation. The skilled kayaker is able to enter a current using diverse curvatures. The maneuver is considered to be concluded not when the kayak has rotated downstream, but when it begins to acquire velocity from the river. Entering an eddy zone with a gentle, precise curve is an essential element for descending a river safely and harmoniously. The velocity of the kayak and the angle of incidence must be prepared upstream of the planned entrance point into the eddy, and this is called anticipation. The anticipation can be greater or lesser according to the velocity of the current and the distance to the eddy. When the bow reaches the eddy line, the downstream side is raised to offer the hull to the eddy current. Entering an eddy signifies turning the entire kayak into the eddy. A skilled kayaker knows how to enter an eddy using diverse curvatures and into diverse zones of the eddy. Entering the top part of the eddy. Entering the middle part of the eddy. Entering the bottom part of the eddy. A tight entrance into an eddy. A wide entrance into an eddy. We must consider the maneuver concluded not when the kayak starts to turn, but when it starts to ascend upstream. It is important to be able to enter an eddy with diverse curvatures, but if the kayaker does practice using very large curves, entering with tight curves will be much easier later. Both for entering the current and for entering an eddy, after the forward paddling to give velocity to the kayak, the most used strokes are the boof stroke, which permits the easiest passage over the eddy line. Then, more forward strokes in the inside of the curve. After the boof stroke, holding the paddle as a rudder inside the curve permits managing the radius in a very precise way. The aim is to maintain the boat in velocity while making a fluid and ample curve. The bow rudder stroke not only establishes a point around which to turn, but also permits at the end of the curve to start the kayak off in the intended direction. We must consider the bow rudder stroke not as the stroke that begins rotation, but as the stroke that permits finishing the curve and starting off again in the new direction. Often, it's advisable to pass from ruddering to a more or less open bow rudder according to the circumstances. The stroke to choose is the one that permits maintaining the kayak's velocity during rotation. Curve maintaining velocity, curve losing velocity. In these last years, more importance has been given to those strokes within the curve that permit widening the trajectory while maintaining velocity. Although they can be used in particular cases, circular paddling on the outside of the curve, backward paddling in the inside of the curve, and braces are normally to be avoided. During maneuvers, keeping the body weight back helps to pass more easily the eddy line and guarantees a gentler, more balanced curve. In maneuvers, maneuvers, the eyes anticipate the rotation. Eyes downstream during eddy out. Eyes upstream during eddy in. It is very important that the shoulders and thus the head be oriented towards the inside of the curve. In small eddies and light currents, the angle of incidence is wider. In large eddies and strong currents, the angle is more narrow. To enter an eddy in a voluminous river, we must think of ferrying the line between current and eddy. It's useful to practice entering the eddy with an S trajectory, to enter one side of the eddy and leave from the other. The line between eddy and current is a turbulent zone where the direction of the water is not clearly defined and therefore to be avoided normally. What allows us to understand if the maneuver has been well performed, apart from reaching the desired goal, is to feel that the kayak runs, seems to slide without unbalancing, and in rotation if it maintains speed and moves with continuity and harmony. The ferry is the maneuver that, keeping the bow turned upstream, permits crossing a stream of current. The physical principle that makes this possible is the so-called coupling of forces, or the result of the downstream force exercised by the current and the force obtained by the velocity of the kayak in the direction of the bow. The angle of incidence to be chosen must balance between the forces that affect the ferry. Angle to closed. Angle to wide. Correct angle. Velocity must be directly proportional to the speed of the current to be crossed. In the initial and central phases of the maneuver, the bow remains pointed upstream, while arriving in the eddy, the bow is oriented downstream, so as to obtain an angle of incidence that permits crossing the eddy line on the other side to re-enter the current. This maneuver is called the final S of the ferry. Ferry with final S. Ferry without final S. The upstream side is raised to offer the hull to the current, and then, before entering the eddy, the downstream side is then raised to offer the hull to the eddy current. Ferry across a wide current. Ferry across a narrow current. It is advantageous to enter the current from the high side of the eddy. The preparatory phase of the ferry is very important, and it's a good idea to initiate departure near the current so as to more easily find the correct angle of incidence. To control the maneuver, it is often sufficient to apply downstream rudder. If the kayak tends to slide downstream during the ferry, a sweep is normally enough to resolve the problem. Keeping the torso inclined backwards will simplify greatly the maneuver, improving balance and control of the kayak. During ferrying, the eyes should be turned to the point to be reached. If the current presents waves, the ideal point to cross is the trough of the wave. Ferrying does not require strength so much as sensitivity and precision in finding the balance among the forces that intervene. A ferry is well done when you have the sensation of effortless gliding on the water, almost as if moved by a magic power. For whitewater technique as well, it is indispensable to acquire proficiency.